Hello friends, as you know we've been running this series on short fiction, and this is rooted particularly in the 19th century Europe, and we have a large number of authors to discuss, and many of them have been discussed so far. And so far as today's lecture is concerned, it is by Professor Payal Nagpal, who teaches English in Janki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University, and she has done some specialized work on fiction in general. So she is our best guide today for the perspective that she's going to give us. And the author that is being discussed today is Zora Neale Hurston, an Afro-American writer, and it's a woman. And let's see the combination of so many perspectives in her personality, in her sensibility, in her writing. And so far as I'm concerned, I'm not exactly familiar with this particular stream of American short fiction, where there is a black woman and an American woman, and with an African background, and she reveals her experiences, expresses them, expresses her sense of priority about issues. And I would in fact request Professor Payal Nagpal also to say something in general about her, so that we know that this is the person and this is how she expresses herself in the fiction. So yours is the floor, so to say.
Thank you so much, Professor Prakash. And I think you absolutely set the stage when you say that there are so many perspectives that actually come into play here. Zora Neale Hurston being an Afro-American writer, so the whole politics of color, the whole idea of being a woman, and her connection with America. I think these factors certainly come into play. So we will be discussing a short story titled Sweat by Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston was born in 1891 and lived up to 1960. And it's very interesting in terms of her biography. It seems that she herself misled people to think that she was born 10 years later, but the correct date is actually 1891. So which means that if we really speaking look at it, she was born towards the absolute end of the last decade, in a sense, of the 19th century, and she lived through a very significant part of the 20th century. She was born in a place called Eatonville, and this is an important aspect of her writing, because Eatonville was also one of the first self-governing black townships that was included in the United States. And her own father actually was the mayor also. So I think this whole idea about a space, that allows the people of color to actually regulate their own and govern their own, town, is an important factor and influenced her greatly. Zora Neale Hurston actually moved to New York finally in 1925. She lost her mother at an early stage, and after that, when her father married the second time, she was not particularly in a very conducive setup. After this, Zora Neale Hurston, once she moved to New York in 1925, a lot of things changed, and she became she of course studied, and she was one of the only black students in Barnard College. She also wrote plays, she wrote several articles, she wrote novels, one of the most famous ones being Their Eyes Were Watching God, which was written published around 1935. She was, of course, part of the Harlem Renaissance. She was recognized as someone, who brought life to the writings and views, in a sense, of people of color. She edited, a journal quarterly called Fire. She also, at some point, quite early in her career, joined a theatre company. So she was, in a sense, a very active participant in a kind of cultural movement. We talk about the Harlem Renaissance. We're talking about a cultural movement in music, in literature, in writing, that allowed, especially people of color, to reimagine their lives. What is very interesting about Zora Neale Hurston is also that she studied anthropology under Franz Boas, and she was also a folklorist. So these two things kind of go together. She collated folk tales, and when she also came out with what was, I think, one of the first published a book on Afro-American folk tales. She wrote a play that was titled Color Struck. She worked closely with Langston Hughes, on a play Mulebone. Unfortunately, that was never really performed. They had a fallout. Her own, autobiography is titled Dust Tracks on a Road, which was published in 1942. And, her book of folklore is titled Mules and Men. So, as mentioned, this was one of the first published books on Afro-American folklore, and also published, by an African American. Um, Joyce Carol Oates, points out that uh, Alice Walker, who's, it is to her credit that a revival of Zora Neale Hurston's writing and interest in her writing, criticism on Hurston, all this, started only when Alice Walker expressed great interest in her writing, and in fact erected a tombstone on her gravesite in the 1970s. That led to a lot of renewed interest in Zora Neale Hurston's work. In fact, to quote Oates on this, she says that Alice Walker at one point says, "For Alice Walker, however, as well as for thousands of Hurston's admirers, she is one of the greatest writers of the century. Walker has declared that if she were relegated to a desert island for the balance of her life with only 10 books to sustain her, she would," to quote Walker on this, "she would choose unhesitatingly two of Zora's. Walker's choices, Mules and Men and Their Eyes Were Watching God, are beyond question two of the finest achievements in African American literature." So I think that is the kind of writing that has been, done and understood as far as Zora Neale Hurston is concerned. And today, to just get a brief insight into the kind of writing that Hurston engaged in and what it really meant, we will be discussing a short story written by Zora Neale Hurston titled Sweat, and it was written around 1926. So this is somewhere along the time that she's also in New York, and she suddenly is exposed to, she's dabbled a little bit in theater, and she's also exposed to a lot of the cultural influences in New York at that point, and she is able to craft her own, hone her own skills and develop and evolve her own craft in a sense of writing, and we can see so in this story, Sweat. If I were to just give a very brief overview of what Sweat is all about, it's about this washwoman Delia. So I think at the very outset, we understand that we are looking at a working class settlement here. And so Delia is a washwoman, and she's completely oppressed in a very, very exploitative marriage. And what is emphasized greatly is the connection between women, labor and sweat, and how the marriage, the entire household, the indulgences of her husband Sykes, all these are actually funded by Delia's sweat. So the story actually can be divided into three very broad sections. The first is where we get an insight into the kind of marriage that is there between Delia and Sykes. The second is where we get a glimpse into the neighborhood in Eatonville, where the men are actually gossiping and discussing, and Delia is, returning the laundry to everybody, and how everybody in the society is actually extremely empathetic towards Delia. And the third part is where Sykes tries to, he gets this rattlesnake, a 6-foot rattlesnake at home, and Delia is very scared of snakes, and he's hoping that at some point, he's a philanderer, so he's hoping at some point the snake is going to sting Delia. However, it's quite the reverse that happens, and there'll be more insights on this when we actually discuss the story. So, but here I'd request Professor Prakash to share his preliminary views on the writer and the story.
I'll express my views in the form of a curiosity, because you used the word the cultural movement of which she was a part, and immediately I thought of the atmosphere at that time, and she saw both the world wars, the First World War and the Second World War, and she died around 1950, you say?
1960.
1960.
Yes.
So which means that she has seen both the wars, and some kind of turmoil would be there in America at that point of time, and there would have been a cultural movement to which you referred. So in what way do you think she is a part of, or she is integrated with, or she is associated with that existing movement, and what it was, if you may just
Yes.
enlighten us?
Yes. So actually, Hurston is part of this movement because when she moves to New York, she meets a lot of writers who are a part of the Harlem Renaissance. She works very closely with Alan Locke, with Langston Hughes, and everybody is also very impressed with her work. And that is why she's one of the only black students in Barnard College, and she also studies, as mentioned, anthropology there. But apart from her academic work, so, writing articles, for instance, apart from Sweat, there is another piece that she writes 2 years later, which is called How It Feels to Be Colored Me. And she, it's like an autobiographical piece. What's very interesting is Eatonville here, because she's coming from a background where this is one of the only probably self-governing black townships that is there, which means that it is away from the influence of the whites in a sense. And in her piece, if it be what it means to be colored me, she talks about how the whites are people who are just passing through this town, and the very fact that her own father was the mayor means something to Zora Neale Hurston. So so it works both ways. On the one hand, she gets this kind of exposure. She's, of course, quite young. She gets this exposure to society in New York, in America by and large. At the same time, and of course, the very, very vital and active Harlem Renaissance. And at the same time, she's also able to speak about issues that have some meaning and have had some bearing on her own life. So in this sense, she's part of the entire cultural movement through her writing. What's indeed very sad is that there is, towards the end of her life, when in fact Oates says that that probably could have been a turning point where a second phase of her writing could have begun, but she's falsely tried in a case and she was not even present in the country. But after that, she kind of rejects any kind of visibility, and she's taking all these, she takes all these odd jobs, very small jobs, and is not very affluent by the time she dies. So this revival that takes place because of Alice Walker in the 1970s is very significant. It gives us a very great insight into a writer who's kind of completely, carving a niche for herself in the 1920s. And, Sweat is written around 1926, so she's obviously had some exposure to the First World War and is writing in the 1920s. But her writing is more about what it means to kind of, grow up, let's say, in a, space that is occupied by the blacks.
At the same time, the explanation that you have given, the way you have interpreted things, I think that that's quite clearly, social and cultural in that sense. And if I say that, if I describe it, and I'll ask your opinion, if I describe her as a kind of bridge between the real life in a small town and the cultural world that she is addressing, the teachers, the writers outside in the urban areas, and she is that kind of a significant bridge. Suppose one describes her like that, how would you react?
Yes, yes, I would agree to that. I would agree to that. And the very fact that, she was also collaborating with other people, she did collaborate with Langston Hughes, as I mentioned, and continued to, her articles kept getting published, and her novels, were, of course, they had a certain, she was able to carve a niche for herself. Her autobiography is again,
I was going to ask this question about autobiography, because she wants to lay bare, in a manner of saying, her heart to the people, telling them what is happening inside her mind, and that is supposed to be shared. And the other thing is that she is talking about the sweat. Sweat is hers as well as of the women around her,
Yes.
and it is that which sustains the social movement at the time.
If we actually analyze Sweat closely, we see that it is a very balanced and controlled and real representation of the lives of women. And what's a very valuable takeaway from Sweat is also the fact that the protagonist is a woman who comes from the common sections of the society. It's a washwoman. She washes clothes, collects all the clothes, sifts them. There's a description about how the whites are separated from colored clothes and so on. That's, of course, also an indication that works at various levels. And how she then, returns the laundry. She goes out. The husband is, of course, absolutely almost abusive in this marriage. So, when we analyze Sweat, we see how, Zora Neale Hurston is totally concerned with representing women and the lives of women, from the common sections.
Autobiography and short story. Is there a connection between the two? So in her case, because in her short story also she is bringing in her own experiences.
Yes, certainly. And I think Zora Neale Hurston is dedicated to representing the lives of, the blacks, especially the black women. So certainly there is a connection. As I mentioned that this piece, if what it means to be colored me, is a piece that is autobiographical.
And the detailing, because she knows so much about life, in the street, life at home, life outside, life in the cities, and that life must have been detailed very well by her.
Very well detailed, and which also tells us of great and sharp powers of observation as far as Hurston is concerned. So I think that is very crucial to her writing. So
now you may tell us about this story that you have to discuss.
So as I mentioned, that it can be divided into three broad sections. One where we get to see the kind of work that she's doing, what her marriage is all about. We then move to the working class neighborhood and we see what the men are talking about, and they're all very, very empathetic towards her and are very, very sharply critical of Sykes. And then the last part, where the snake enters the story. And what's very interesting is the kind of build-up that is there. It's almost as if the story begins at a point where Delia has had enough in this marriage, and she just will not take it anymore, and she each time Sykes, her husband, says something to her, she also kind of puts him in his place. And that is a turning point. He really speaking is very surprised and does not know how to react to it and how to accept what is called in the story the new Delia. So it's the beginnings of this that we actually see here. So again, as I said, that's something that's been emphasized right through the story is sweat. It's the connection between women and labor, how it is the women who are performing the labor and productive labor. This is not only being a homemaker, but she's actually a woman who's working, and she's the one who's earning the money, and Sykes, of course, is the philanderer who's going to just waste everything. So if you look at the first couple of lines, it was 11 o'clock of a spring night in Florida. It was Sunday. Any other night, Delia Jones would have been in bed for 2 hours by this time. But she was a washwoman, and Monday morning meant a great deal to her. So she collected the soiled clothes on Saturday when she returned the clean things. Sunday night after church, she sorted them and put the white things to soak. It saved her almost a half-day's start. A great hamper in the bedroom held the clothes that she brought home. It was neater than a number of bundles lying around. And so this is her work. This is the work that she does. It is productive, socially productive work. And at the same time, Sykes enters the story, and there is an indication of the snake right at the beginning. So there is, just as she is working, there is something, and it's described as a long, round, limp and black. It falls on her shoulders, and that is a whip. It is a whip that her husband uses to scare her and to, be violent with her, to beat her. Now, the term is, the whip is akin to the snake, and it's described, and the word that is used is how it slithered to the floor beside her. So it's very clear that right from the beginning, this connection between a snake and the whip is established. And here, there is a sense that, this is something that has a very important bearing, really speaking, in the story. So she's very scared, like she's scared of the snake. She's momentarily scared of the whip that he uses to scare her. It softened her knees, it dried her mouth, and she didn't know what to do. So this build-up is already there. And another thing that is very important in this particular story is language. So it's not, the entire story is not in what one would say, the proper English. So there is the use of the vernacular, there's the use of the dialect here, and that is very important. For example, when she gets back at Sykes, she says, "Sykes, what do you throw that whip on me like that? You know it would scare me." So if we see this use of what one calls broken English, which is used by the blacks in that particular context, is very important, because Zora Neale Hurston at that point is also very conscious of the language that is being used. So I think on the one hand, where the narrative voice is using regular English, here the use of the dialect is significant because it indicates how Hurston is providing proper space and expression to the language, to the culture, to the lives of the people. So the fact that she's conscious of this, and we are talking 1920s, is very, very important. And of course, Hurston being a woman writer, so she says that she's scared of the whip, and she mentions that this whip is pretty much like a snake. She tells the husband that that I'm very scared of snakes, and why are you throwing this whip
I'm struck by this particular idea. He is doing something and she questions him. And this questioning is at the root of the story. Why are you doing it? Please explain. So that's what she is saying to the husband.
Yes, and in fact, what is very important in this story, it begins, as I said, at the point where Delia has decided that somewhere she has decided in a very controlled sort of manner that she's not going to take it anymore. So her asking this question, as you rightly mentioned, is something that Sykes is not used to.
It's a reproof.
Absolutely. It's a reproof, and he's just not used to it, and he does not know how to react to, and she's actually, Hurston calls her the new Delia. So she does not know, he does not know how he's supposed to react to this. And at one point she shows her anger also. So actually, in this story, there is a gradual build-up.
And see the irony. You see, the man is made to speak and he doesn't know how to speak. He can only beat her up.
Yes.
He can only use the whip, but he can't tell.
Yes.
So his helplessness is very clearly ironical.
His helplessness is ironical, and the whip is the snake at the beginning, and this transforms into the real snake in the third part of the story. And of course, it's not Delia, but it's Sykes who gets bitten by the snake. So and he's the one who dies. So there is a reversal at the end. So of course we'll come to that. So Delia, of course, continues with her work, and she continues to wash the clothes. And Sykes, on the other hand, because he has absolutely no response to give to this as to why he is doing these things, he just kicks all the clothes around and makes sure that she has to spend more time in engaging with the work. She will again have to sort everything because he mixes all the white clothes with the colored clothes and so on. So
friends, we have in this section a beginning of the discussion about the short story, and this beginning actually follows the descriptions that will now be reflected in the story itself. So it's a kind of a unified thing that you are in for understanding, for appreciating. And the society expresses itself through that story, which Professor Payal Nagpal will now further analyze in the second part of the discussion. Thank you.